Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries. It was a blistering afternoon in mid-July when the Carter sisters arrived at the small, unassuming house on the edge of town. The sun beat down mercilessly, its heat bouncing off the cracked pavement, while the sound of cicadas echoed through the trees. The girls were tired and sunburnt, their feet heavy from the long walk from the train station. Emily, the elder of the two at 16, wiped a layer of sweat from her forehead, her gaze fixed on the sagging porch of the Miller household. Her eyes were dull, shadows etched beneath them, a stark contrast to the bright energy she used to carry. Beside her, Jenny, 2 years younger and limping slightly from her polio, looked as fragile as a wilted flower, her small frame shivering despite the heat. She leaned on her sister, her cane thudding softly against the dirt path with every step. "Are we really staying here?" Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, though her chest tightened at the sight of the house. There was something unsettling about it. It wasn't the peeling paint or the broken windows, it was the quiet. The kind of oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to break. They didn't have a choice. Their parents, carnival workers, couldn't afford to take care of them while traveling from town to town. For a mere $20 a week, the girls were handed over to Margaret Miller, a woman they had never met, a stranger who, as far as they knew, would be their caretaker for the foreseeable future. Emily tried to push away the growing unease gnawing at her insides. She had to be strong, for Jenny. Always for Jenny. She adjusted her grip on her sister's arm as they made their way up the creaking steps to the front door. Margaret Miller opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was tall and thin, her face angular, the sharp lines of her cheekbones making her look gaunt. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, strands of gray mixing with her once dark curls. But it was her eyes that struck Emily the most, cold, piercing, and devoid of warmth. "You must be the Carter girls," Margaret said, her voice clipped and efficient. Her gaze flickered over them, lingering on Emily for a moment before shifting to Jenny, the limp in her step not escaping notice. "Come inside. It's too hot to stand around." The house was as dreary inside as it was outside. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture old and worn. The air was thick and musty, as though the windows hadn't been opened in years. Emily wrinkled her nose at the smell but didn't say anything. Margaret led them to a small sitting room, where the air felt even heavier, and motioned for them to sit on a faded couch that sagged in the middle. The woman stood over them, arms crossed. "So," Margaret began, her tone sharp now, "your parents sent you here to stay while they're off gallivanting across the country. I don't tolerate nonsense, you understand. You'll do your share of chores, keep the house in order, and behave. This isn't some free vacation." Emily nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." Jenny remained silent, her eyes cast down at her lap. Margaret's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer, as if sizing them up. Then, without another word, she turned and left the room, her footsteps fading down the hallway. The silence that followed was suffocating. The first few days passed quietly, but there was an underlying tension that never seemed to ease. Emily and Jenny were given a small, cramped room in the back of the house, with 2 twin beds and a single, dusty window that barely let in any light. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. Emily took on most of the chores, refusing to let Jenny overexert herself. Margaret was always watching, her eyes following them with an unnerving intensity, though she rarely spoke. The other children in the house, Derek, Samantha, and Lily, were eerily quiet, their interactions with the girls limited to short, curt exchanges. It didn't take long for Emily to notice that something was off. Margaret's behavior was erratic. One minute she would be calm and composed, instructing Emily on how to clean the floors or tend to the garden. The next, she would fly into a fit of rage, screaming at the girls for the smallest mistake, a dish not washed properly, a bed not made to her liking. Her temper was unpredictable, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But it wasn't just Margaret. The entire household seemed to operate under a cloud of fear. Derek, the eldest of Margaret's children at 15, rarely spoke. He kept to himself, his face always set in a cold, distant expression. There was something unsettling about the way he watched Emily, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Samantha and Lily, both younger than Jenny, were quieter still, their eyes wide and fearful whenever Margaret was around. They seemed to move in a constant state of caution, as if any wrong step could bring down their mother's wrath. Emily noticed that Margaret's punishments became more frequent and harsher, especially when the weekly payments from her parents were delayed. The first time it happened, Margaret lashed out at both sisters, though she focused most of her anger on Emily. A slap across the face for not having dinner ready on time. A yank of the hair for speaking out of turn. At first, Emily thought she could handle it. She had to. Jenny needed her to be strong, to protect her from Margaret's wrath. But the punishments escalated, slowly but surely. One evening, after a particularly brutal outburst from Margaret, Emily found herself locked in the small, windowless closet in the hallway. The air inside was stifling, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. She could hear Jenny crying on the other side of the door, but there was nothing she could do. Hours passed, and Margaret didn't return to let her out. The next morning, when Emily was finally released, her legs were numb, and her throat was dry. Margaret acted as though nothing had happened, going about her day with the same cold, detached demeanor. But something had shifted. Emily could feel it. As the days dragged on, a new element was introduced into their lives. The neighborhood kids, who Emily had initially assumed were friendly and harmless, began visiting the house more frequently. At first, they seemed like any other group of children, laughing, playing games, chasing each other around the yard. But it soon became clear that their visits were anything but innocent. Margaret seemed to encourage their presence, often inviting them inside the house, where they would watch as Emily and Jenny were forced to do their chores under her strict supervision. There was something cruel in the way the kids watched, their eyes glinting with a strange, unsettling curiosity. One afternoon, while Emily was scrubbing the kitchen floor, a boy named Tommy, no older than 12, sauntered into the room with a smirk on his face. "Mrs. Miller says you're not doing it right," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe you need to be taught a lesson." Before Emily could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching with a cold, approving gaze. "Go on, Tommy," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Show her how it's done." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as Tommy knelt beside her, grabbing the scrub brush from her hand. He shoved her aside, his movements rough and unkind. "That's how you do it," he sneered, pushing her face closer to the dirty floor. The other kids giggled from the hallway, their eyes gleaming with a mix of amusement and cruelty. Margaret said nothing, her cold gaze never leaving Emily. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere in the house grew darker with each passing day. Emily could feel it, the mounting tension, the growing cruelty from both Margaret and the neighborhood kids. It was as if the house itself was feeding off their suffering, its walls absorbing every scream, every sob, every whispered plea for mercy. Emily tried to stay strong, for Jenny's sake, but the constant abuse was wearing her down. She had bruises on her arms and legs, her hands raw from the endless chores, her spirit slowly breaking under the weight of Margaret's cruelty. And all the while, the neighborhood kids continued to visit, their laughter ringing through the house like a twisted mockery of normalcy. They watched, participated, even encouraged Margaret's punishments, their youthful faces twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Emily couldn't understand it. How could they be so cruel? So heartless? These were children, after all. But then again, Margaret wasn't the only monster in that house. The real horror, Emily realized, wasn't just the woman who stood over them, barking orders and delivering punishment. It was the complicity of everyone around them. The silence. The indifference. The laughter. And worst of all, the knowledge that no one was coming to save them. The oppressive summer heat showed no signs of relenting, and with it came the gradual isolation of the Carter sisters. Days blended into each other, a monotonous loop of chores, punishments, and dread. The girls rarely left the house, save for the occasional errand Margaret would send them on, usually to the corner store or the post office. But even those short trips offered little relief. They were always under the watchful eye of Margaret's children or the neighborhood kids who had somehow ingratiated themselves into the family's daily life. Emily, as always, bore the brunt of the abuse. She had grown accustomed to the harsh words, the slaps, and the kicks. Her once bright eyes were now dull, her movements mechanical. The world outside the house seemed to shrink, as though it no longer existed. There was only the house, Margaret, and the ever-present threat of punishment. For Jenny, the isolation was even worse. Her limp had worsened from the lack of proper care, and the taunts from Margaret and the neighborhood kids only deepened her insecurities. She rarely spoke, keeping her head down, her eyes always cast to the floor. Emily tried to shield her as best she could, but there was only so much she could do. Margaret had a way of twisting everything, making the girls feel as though their suffering was their own fault. If only they were more obedient, more efficient in their chores, more grateful for the roof over their heads, then maybe they wouldn't need to be punished. But the truth was, no matter how hard they tried, Margaret always found a reason to lash out. It was late one evening when the first true sign of danger appeared. Emily was in the kitchen, scrubbing the floor as she had done countless times before. The house was quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of her scrubbing and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the others moved about the house. Margaret had been in an unusually foul mood that day, though Emily wasn't sure why. Perhaps the payment from their parents had been late again, or maybe one of the other children had done something to upset her. Whatever the reason, Margaret's rage had been palpable, simmering just below the surface, ready to explode at any moment. Emily tried to keep her head down, to avoid drawing attention to herself. She had learned that lesson early on. But it didn't matter. No matter how careful she was, Margaret always found her. Emily, Margaret's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting Margaret's icy gaze. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her arms crossed over her chest. "You missed a spot," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Emily swallowed hard, her hand shaking slightly as she picked up the scrub brush again. She bent down to continue scrubbing, her movements quick and frantic, desperate to avoid Margaret's wrath. But it was too late. Before she could react, Margaret grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back violently. Emily let out a small gasp of pain, her hands flying up to try and loosen Margaret's grip. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Margaret hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just do a half-assed job and get away with it?" Emily whimpered, tears stinging her eyes as Margaret's grip tightened. "I'm sorry," she managed to choke out. "I'm sorry." Margaret released her suddenly, shoving her to the floor. Emily landed hard on her side, the breath knocked out of her. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, her body trembling. "Get up," Margaret snapped. "And don't make me repeat myself." Emily scrambled to her feet, her whole body aching. She picked up the scrub brush again, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She could feel Margaret's eyes on her, watching her every move, waiting for her to make another mistake. But the mistake didn't come from Emily this time. It came from Jenny. It was a small act of defiance, almost imperceptible in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough to set Margaret off. Jenny had been sweeping the hallway, her limp more pronounced than usual after a long day of chores. She moved slowly, her cane tapping against the floor with every step. But she had made the mistake of resting for just a moment, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. Margaret saw it, of course. She saw everything. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret's voice rang out, harsh and unforgiving. Jenny's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. I am sorry," she stammered. "I just needed a moment." "You don't get moments," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "You're here to work, not to sit around and feel sorry for yourself." Jenny's face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. But Margaret wasn't done. She stormed down the hallway, her footsteps heavy and menacing. Emily watched in horror from the kitchen doorway as Margaret grabbed Jenny by the arm, dragging her forward. "You think because you're crippled, you get special treatment." Margaret spat, her grip tightening on Jenny's arm. "You think you're above the rules?" Jenny shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "No, ma'am, I don't." "Then act like it," Margaret snapped, shoving Jenny to the floor. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She wanted to help, to do something, but she knew it would only make things worse. Margaret's rage was like a wildfire. Once it started, there was no stopping it. Jenny lay on the floor, sobbing quietly, her small frame trembling. Margaret stood over her, breathing heavily, her eyes wild with fury. "Get up," she ordered. Jenny struggled to push herself up, but her arms were weak, her body exhausted from the day's labor. She barely made it to her knees before Margaret yanked her to her feet, dragging her back down the hallway. "Maybe a night in the basement will teach you some respect," Margaret snarled. Emily's stomach dropped. The basement. She had only been down there once, when they first arrived, to fetch something for Margaret. It was cold and damp, the air thick with mildew. The thought of Jenny being locked down there for the night made her blood run cold. "No," Emily whispered, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "Please, don't." Margaret whirled around, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "What did you say?" Emily's mouth went dry. She wanted to apologize, to take it back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Margaret's gaze flickered between the two girls, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "You want to take her place?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with malice. Emily didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'll take her place." Margaret's smile widened, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a glimmer of something dark and twisted in the woman's eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps. Or maybe something worse. "Very well," Margaret said, her voice cold and emotionless. "You'll take her place." The door to the basement creaked as it opened, the sound echoing through the silent house. Emily's heart raced as she stepped forward, her legs shaking with every step. The air was cooler down here, but it wasn't a relief, it was a different kind of chill, the kind that settled into your bones and made your skin crawl. Margaret pushed her forward, and Emily stumbled, catching herself just before she fell. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The floor was made of cold, cracked cement, and the walls were lined with shelves full of old, dusty boxes and jars. It smelled of damp earth and rot. Margaret didn't say anything as she shoved Emily toward the far corner of the basement. There was an old, rusted cot there, its thin mattress stained and torn. Emily's stomach churned at the sight of it. "You'll stay here for the night," Margaret said, her voice as cold as the air around them. "Think about your actions." With that, she turned and left, the door slamming shut behind her. The sound echoed through the basement, leaving Emily alone in the darkness. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Emily sat on the edge of the cot, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her legs. The cold from the floor seeped into her bones, making her shiver despite the summer heat outside. Every creak of the house above sent a jolt of fear through her, as though at any moment Margaret might come back, or worse, something else might. The darkness played tricks on her mind. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence. She tried to stay calm, to keep her breathing steady, but the fear was overwhelming. And then, just as she was beginning to drift off to sleep, she heard it. A faint sound. A whisper, perhaps, or the scrape of something against the floor. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her eyes snapping open. She held her breath, straining to hear it again. But there was only silence. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, that her mind was playing tricks on her after hours of being alone in the dark. But then she heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone, or something, moving in the shadows. She froze, her body tensing as her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Only darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. Emily's breath hitched in her throat as she slowly stood up, her legs shaking. She backed away from the cot, her eyes wide with fear. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer. But the sound continued. A slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy against the floor. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed up against the wall, her hands shaking. She could feel the cold, damp stone pressing against her back, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence filled the room once again. Emily stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She waited, listening, but there was nothing. Only the sound of her own breathing and the distant creak of the house settling above her. Slowly, she let out a shaky breath, her body relaxing just slightly. Maybe it had been nothing after all. Maybe she was just hearing things, her mind playing tricks on her after so many hours of isolation and fear. But just as she was beginning to calm down, she heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. A voice. Whispering her name. The next morning, Emily was released from the basement. Her body was sore, her muscles stiff from the cold and the fear that had gripped her throughout the night. Margaret offered no explanation for her release, nor did she acknowledge the punishment. It was as though nothing had happened. But something had changed. The basement had left a mark on Emily, not just physically, but mentally. The hours of isolation, the strange noises, and the whisper that called her name haunted her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been down there with her. Yet, when she tried to make sense of it, it felt illogical. Rational thought told her she was just hearing things, her mind playing tricks on her after hours of stress and exhaustion. But another part of her, the part that had listened to the whispers, told her something darker was lurking in the shadows of this house. Margaret, for her part, seemed content with the newfound obedience of both sisters. Jenny, terrified of ending up in the basement herself, had grown even quieter, her eyes constantly darting toward Margaret, as if anticipating the next blow. Emily did her best to shield her younger sister, but the mental toll was beginning to show. Margaret's children, sensing the girl's vulnerability, became more brazen. They mocked and harassed them, spurred on by their mother's cold indifference. Even the local kids who once hesitated to get involved now joined in, finding cruel amusement in the suffering of the sisters. The Carter house had become a twisted circus, where torment was the main attraction, and Emily and Jenny were the unwilling stars. One of the most painful aspects of their ordeal was the neighbors' silence. People in the surrounding houses must have heard the shouting, the screams, the sound of fists against flesh. But no one intervened. No one came to the door. No one called the police. It wasn't that the neighbors didn't know. On the rare occasions when Emily and Jenny were allowed to leave the house, the wary glances from the people they passed were proof enough. The bruises on Emily's face and arms were impossible to hide, and Jenny's limp had only grown worse, her frail body moving with increasing difficulty. And yet, whenever they passed a neighbor, there was only one reaction, averted eyes and a hurried pace, as though acknowledging the girl's suffering would somehow infect their own lives. Margaret's reputation as a hard, no-nonsense woman had always kept people at a distance. But now, it was as if the entire neighborhood had collectively agreed to ignore what was happening behind closed doors. Fear. Apathy. Emily couldn't tell. All she knew was that she and Jenny were on their own. As the days passed, the psychological toll of their situation became increasingly apparent. Emily, once strong-willed and defiant, now found herself plagued by paranoia. She began to notice things, small, seemingly insignificant details, that she couldn't explain. Objects in the house seemed to move on their own. A chair that had been tucked under the dining table would suddenly be out of place. A picture frame would be tilted, though no one had touched it. At first, she dismissed these occurrences as the result of her frayed nerves, but the more they happened, the harder it became to ignore. Her nights were the worst. Since the basement, Emily had struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house, every distant sound, made her jump. She would lie awake for hours, her heart pounding in her chest, listening to the steady breathing of her sister beside her. On more than one occasion, she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway outside their room, slow, deliberate, as though someone were pacing back and forth. But whenever she worked up the courage to check, the hallway would be empty. The lack of sleep, the constant fear, and the sense of isolation began to wear on her mind. She started to question her own reality. Was Margaret doing this intentionally? Was she trying to drive them mad, to break them down completely? Or was it something more sinister? Something unseen? Jenny, too, was suffering. Her limp had worsened, and the constant abuse had left her frail and weak. But it was more than that. Emily could see it in her sister's eyes, the fear, the exhaustion, the growing sense of hopelessness. Jenny had always been the quieter of the two, more reserved, more willing to accept their circumstances without complaint. But now, there was a haunted look in her eyes, as if she were retreating further into herself with each passing day. Margaret, sensing the girls' breaking points, seemed to take pleasure in their suffering. She would invent new games for them to play, each one more humiliating and degrading than the last. One afternoon, she gathered her children and the neighborhood kids into the living room, ordering Emily and Jenny to perform for them like circus animals. "Let's see how long you can stand on one foot," Margaret said, her voice dripping with cruelty as she grinned at the group of children gathered around her. Emily glanced at Jenny, who looked back at her with wide, terrified eyes. They had no choice but to comply. The game began innocently enough, standing on one foot, balancing as best they could while the children laughed and jeered. But Margaret quickly grew bored. She started throwing objects at them, small rocks, pieces of paper, whatever she could find. The children followed her lead, laughing as they pelted Emily and Jenny with debris. Jenny, already weak from the constant abuse, was the first to falter. Her leg gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she stood up from her chair, her hands on her hips. "I didn't say you could stop," she said coldly, her voice devoid of any compassion. Jenny tried to push herself back up, but her body was too weak. Emily rushed to her side, helping her sister to her feet, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You think you can just quit whenever you want," she spat, grabbing Jenny by the arm and dragging her toward the door. "I'll show you what happens when you give up." Without another word, she shoved Jenny outside, slamming the door behind her. The children gathered around the window, watching with gleeful anticipation as Margaret locked the door, leaving Jenny out in the cold. Emily's heart raced as she pressed her face against the glass, watching her sister's frail figure standing in the yard, trembling in the cool evening air. She wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but she knew better. Margaret wouldn't allow it. The children laughed and cheered, mocking Jenny as she stood there, shivering and alone. Emily felt a wave of anger and despair wash over her. How could this be happening? How could people be so cruel? Margaret's voice cut through her thoughts. Maybe a night out in the cold will teach her some respect. Something unexpected happened that night. For the first time in months, one of the neighbors finally spoke up. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She had been watching from her porch, her wrinkled face drawn with concern as she saw Jenny standing outside in the cold. Mrs. Henderson had always been a quiet woman, keeping to herself and rarely getting involved in other people's business. But that night, something inside her snapped. She marched down the street, her cane tapping against the pavement as she approached the Carter house. Emily watched in disbelief as the old woman knocked on the door, her voice trembling with anger as she called out Margaret's name. Margaret opened the door, her expression darkening as she saw Mrs. Henderson standing on her porch. "What do you want?" Margaret snapped, her voice cold and dismissive. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "You're going to let that girl back inside," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "You can't treat them like this." For a moment, Margaret looked taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone to challenge her, least of all the old woman from down the street. But her shock quickly turned to anger. "I can do whatever I damn well please," Margaret spat. "These girls are my responsibility, not yours." Mrs. Henderson's grip tightened on her cane. "They're children," she said softly. "They don't deserve this." Margaret's eyes blazed with fury. "Mind your own business, old woman, or you'll regret it." The tension between the two women hung thick in the air, and for a moment, it seemed as though Mrs. Henderson might back down. But to everyone's surprise, she didn't. "If you don't let her back inside," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, her voice shaking, "I'll call the police." Margaret's expression faltered for just a second. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and slammed the door in Mrs. Henderson's face. But it was enough. A few moments later, the door opened again, and Jenny was allowed back inside. Mrs. Henderson's small act of defiance gave Emily and Jenny something they hadn't felt in a long time, a glimmer of hope. It was a tiny spark, barely noticeable amidst the darkness of their lives, but it was there. Someone had spoken up for them. Someone had noticed. But it wasn't enough. Margaret's fury at being challenged only grew after that night. The punishments became more severe, the games more sadistic. And yet, that small act of kindness from Mrs. Henderson lingered in Emily's mind. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare after all. The following days brought no relief for Emily and Jenny. Margaret's cruelty only intensified after Mrs. Henderson's intervention. She seemed more determined than ever to assert her control over the two sisters, making every aspect of their lives more unbearable. Tasks that had once been simple, cleaning the house, fetching water, preparing meals, became grueling punishments as Margaret found new ways to humiliate and degrade them. Margaret's children, emboldened by their mother's escalating behavior, joined in eagerly. The house was filled with constant taunts and laughter as the children found cruel pleasure in the girls' suffering. They threw objects, pulled at their hair, and even spat at them as they passed by. Emily did her best to protect Jenny, but there was little she could do. The beatings, the taunts, the constant fear, they were wearing both sisters down, mentally and physically. Margaret's temper had always been unpredictable, but now it seemed to flare at the smallest provocation. A simple mistake, spilled water, a misplaced object, would send her into a violent rage. She would slap and shove the girls, her voice rising to a shriek as she berated them for their incompetence. Emily had grown used to Margaret's fury, but it never became any easier to endure. Each blow, each cruel word, left an invisible scar on her mind, deepening the sense of hopelessness that had taken root in her heart. But Margaret's violence wasn't always physical. Sometimes, her words alone were enough to cause pain. She would sit the girls down in front of her, a cold smile on her face as she listed their failures, telling them they were worthless, unwanted, that no one would ever come to save them. It was a different kind of torture, one that cut deeper than any slap or punch. And in those moments, Emily could see the cracks forming in her sister's spirit. Jenny's health continued to deteriorate. The abuse, the constant fear, and the lack of proper food had taken their toll on her fragile body. She was pale, her cheeks sunken, and her limp had become more pronounced. She could barely keep up with the daily tasks Margaret demanded of her, and every time she faltered, Margaret's wrath came down on her with renewed force. Emily watched helplessly as her sister grew weaker by the day. She tried to protect Jenny as best she could, taking on more of the workload, offering her meager portions of food, but it wasn't enough. Jenny's body was failing, and Emily could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that she wouldn't survive much longer. But it wasn't just Jenny's body that was breaking. Her mind was beginning to slip as well. She had always been the quieter of the two sisters, more willing to accept their circumstances, but now there was a distant look in her eyes, as if she were retreating into herself, shutting out the horrors of their reality. She barely spoke anymore, and when she did, it was in short, disconnected sentences that made little sense. Emily feared that her sister was losing her grip on reality. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, Emily sat with Jenny in their small, shared room. Jenny was lying on the cot, her breathing shallow, her eyes half closed. Emily knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's face. "We can't keep living like this," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. "We have to find a way out." Jenny didn't respond. She stared blankly at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "I've been thinking," Emily continued, her voice barely audible. "We can't wait for someone to help us. No one's coming. We have to do something ourselves. We have to escape." The word felt heavy in the air, as though it were something dangerous, something forbidden. Escape. It was a distant, almost impossible dream. But it was all they had left. Jenny turned her head slightly, her dull eyes focusing on Emily for the first time in days. She didn't speak, but there was a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "I've been watching," Emily went on, her voice growing more determined. "There are moments when Margaret lets her guard down. She gets distracted by the kids, or she leaves the house for errands. If we time it right, we could slip out, find a way to run, to hide. Maybe we could make it to town, find someone who'll help us." Jenny's lips parted as though she were about to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she simply closed her eyes again, her body limp against the cot. Emily's heart sank. She knew her sister was too weak to run. But she couldn't let that stop her. She had to believe there was still hope, still a way out of this nightmare. Days passed as Emily carefully observed the rhythms of the household, waiting for the perfect opportunity. She knew they would only have one chance, one brief window when Margaret's attention would be elsewhere. But as the days stretched on, the plan began to feel more like a fantasy than a reality. Margaret seemed to sense that something was amiss. Her watchful eyes followed Emily's every move, her temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Finally, the day came. Margaret announced that she would be going into town to pick up supplies, leaving the children behind. She gave strict orders to her eldest daughter to watch over Emily and Jenny, but Emily had noticed something: Margaret's children were easily distracted. Once Margaret was out of the house, the children would lose interest in the sisters, focusing instead on their own games and mischief. As soon as Margaret left, Emily knew it was time. She hurried to Jenny's side, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is it," she whispered, gripping Jenny's hand tightly. "We have to go now." Jenny's eyes fluttered open, her expression dazed and unfocused. "Can you stand?" Emily asked urgently. Jenny didn't respond at first, but with Emily's help, she slowly pushed herself up from the cot. Her legs were shaky, her body weak, but she managed to stand, leaning heavily on Emily for support. Together, they moved quietly through the house, their eyes darting around for any sign of Margaret's children. Emily's heart raced as they crept toward the back door, her mind filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They were so close. So close to freedom. But just as they reached the door, a voice rang out behind them. "Where do you think you're going?" Emily's heart sank as she turned to see Margaret's eldest daughter standing in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, a smug smile on her face. "Going somewhere," the girl taunted, her eyes gleaming with malice. Panic surged through Emily's body. They had been caught. The plan was falling apart. Desperation took over as she tried to think of a way out. But before she could react, the girl lunged at them, grabbing Jenny by the arm and yanking her back into the house. Jenny cried out in pain as she stumbled, her frail body collapsing to the floor. Emily's vision blurred with rage as she rushed to her sister's side, but it was too late. The girl was already shouting for the other children, calling them to come and help. Within moments, the house was filled with the sound of footsteps as the other kids rushed to the scene, their faces twisted with excitement at the prospect of another game. When Margaret returned home later that evening, she was greeted by the sight of Emily and Jenny huddled in a corner, their bodies bruised and battered from the children's attacks. "You thought you could escape?" Margaret sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You thought you could just run away?" She grabbed Emily by the hair, yanking her to her feet as she spat out her next words. "No one escapes from me." The punishment that followed was the worst the girls had ever endured. Margaret's fury was unmatched as she beat them, her blows raining down with a terrifying intensity. Emily tried to shield Jenny from the worst of it, but there was only so much she could do. By the time it was over, both girls were barely conscious, their bodies broken, their spirits crushed. Margaret stood over them, her chest heaving with anger, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "You'll never try that again," she hissed, before turning and leaving the room, slamming the door behind her. Emily lay on the floor, gasping for breath, her mind racing. The escape attempt had failed. They were trapped. And now, more than ever, Emily realized the terrible truth: if they didn't find a way out soon, they wouldn't survive. The days dragged on in a haze of pain and confusion. Emily lay on the cot beside Jenny, both of them silent as they tried to process the brutality they had just endured. Their bodies ached, and their spirits felt as if they were trapped in an unending nightmare. The humiliation, the fear, and the physical pain were etched into their memories like scars that would never fade. Emily turned her head to look at her sister, who lay next to her, staring blankly at the ceiling. Jenny's eyes were dull, devoid of the spark they once held. The fragile thread that had held her spirit together was fraying, and Emily felt a sense of panic rising within her. She couldn't lose her sister, not now, not after everything they had endured. "We have to keep trying, Jenny," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't give up." Jenny turned her head slightly, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of understanding in her sister's gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the emptiness that had become all too familiar. Life in the Banaszewski household resumed, but it was far from normal. Margaret's fury had transformed into a relentless obsession with maintaining control over Emily and Jenny. She upped the stakes, implementing new rules that felt more like chains than guidelines. The girls were subjected to increasingly humiliating chores, and Margaret found new ways to belittle and dehumanize them. "Do you think you can escape from me?" she would hiss as she loomed over them, her eyes cold and predatory. "You're mine. You will always be mine." Emily felt the weight of those words pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had always been the stronger of the two, but the relentless torment was taking its toll. Each day that passed without a plan to escape felt like a countdown, a reminder that they were running out of time. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's determination grew stronger. She began to notice that not all of Margaret's children were completely loyal to their mother. Some seemed uncomfortable with the way she treated Emily and Jenny. One day, while dusting the living room, Emily overheard two of Margaret's younger children whispering to each other, their faces twisted in worry. "I don't like what she's doing to them," one child said, glancing nervously toward the kitchen where Margaret was busy preparing dinner. "They're just the new ones." "It's not our fault," the other replied, but there was a hesitation in their voice that suggested doubt. Emily's heart raced at the possibility of allies. Perhaps they could turn some of Margaret's children against her, enlist their help to escape. But just as she began to build that hope, betrayal struck. One evening, Emily confided in one of the children, a boy named Tommy, about her plans to escape. He had seemed genuinely sympathetic, offering her furtive glances and whispered words of encouragement. But the next morning, Margaret's voice echoed through the house like a thunderclap. "Who told you about the escape?" she shouted, her rage palpable. Emily's heart sank as she realized Tommy had betrayed her, revealing their conversation in exchange for favor with his mother. The weight of that betrayal felt like a stone in her gut, suffocating her hope. Days passed, and Emily felt her resolve hardening into something fierce and unyielding. She would not let her sister's fading spirit be the end of their story. She started devising a new plan, one that involved confronting Margaret directly. If she could break through Margaret's twisted facade, she might stand a chance of saving both of them. The confrontation would be dangerous, but Emily was willing to risk everything. She spent her nights plotting and preparing, waiting for the perfect moment when Margaret's attention would waver. She practiced what she would say, rehearsing the lines in her mind until they felt like a mantra. "We're not your toys, Margaret. We're not your prisoners anymore." It was time to face the monster. The day came when Emily knew she could no longer wait. Margaret had been unusually volatile that week, her outbursts growing more frequent and her patience wearing thin. It was the perfect storm, and Emily felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she confronted her tormentor. "Margaret," she called, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "We need to talk." Margaret turned slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to amusement as she sized up Emily. "Oh. You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that I would want to hear?" Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall. "You don't own us. We're not your property, and we refuse to be treated like this any longer." Margaret's laughter echoed through the room, sharp and mocking. "You think you can just walk away? You're nothing without me. No one will help you. You're nothing but a pair of worthless girls." But Emily pressed on, her voice rising. "We're stronger than you think. You can't break us forever. We will escape, and you won't be able to stop us." For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a flash, Margaret lunged forward, her hand striking Emily across the face. The impact sent her sprawling to the ground, but she quickly regained her composure, defiance sparking in her eyes. The fight ignited something within Emily, a fire of determination she hadn't known was there. As Margaret's anger boiled over, Emily seized the opportunity. She called for Jenny, urging her to get up and follow her lead. In the chaos of Margaret's fury, the sisters made their move. They darted toward the back door, heart pounding in their chests as they pushed through the frame and into the yard. The night air felt electric as they sprinted toward the darkness of the trees lining the property. "Run!" Emily shouted, not daring to look back. The sound of Margaret's furious shouts echoed behind them, a chilling reminder of the danger they were leaving behind. They sprinted through the woods, the underbrush snagging at their clothes as they raced toward the distant sound of traffic. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown, each step a desperate plea for freedom. After what felt like an eternity, the sisters emerged from the tree line, breathless and shaking. They stumbled onto a quiet road, the headlights of passing cars illuminating their path. In that moment, hope surged within Emily. We have to find someone, anyone who can help us, she gasped, her eyes scanning the darkened landscape. As they waved down a car, the driver's expression shifted from confusion to concern as they noticed the girl's disheveled state. What happened? Are you okay? The driver asked, eyes wide with alarm. We need help, Emily cried, feeling the weight of their ordeal crash down upon her. Please, just take us somewhere safe. The driver nodded, their expression shifting to determination. They ushered the girls into the car, and as they sped away from the nightmare, Emily felt a weight lifting from her chest. After sharing their story with the authorities, Emily and Jenny began the long journey of recovery. The trauma of their experience would haunt them for years to come, but they had each other, and that was something no one could take away. As the legal proceedings against Margaret unfolded, Emily found herself in a whirlwind of emotions. The courtrooms were filled with the echoes of their torment, but each testimony brought them closer to justice. Margaret was ultimately convicted for her crimes, her reign of terror coming to an end at last. In the aftermath of their ordeal, Emily and Jenny began to rebuild their lives. With the help of counselors and support groups, they slowly started to heal. Emily often found herself reflecting on their journey, grateful for the bond that had grown stronger through their suffering. Remember when we thought we wouldn't survive? Emily said one evening as they sat on the porch of their new home, the sun setting on the horizon. Jenny nodded, a small smile breaking through her uncertainty. But we did. We're still here. And as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting warm hues across the sky, they knew they had fought their way to freedom, a testament to their resilience and the unbreakable bond of sisterhood.